In this lesson, we're going to take a look at rigging torsos and heads. And when I say heads, I don't mean faces. We're going to look at facial rigging in upcoming lessons. But I'm just talking about the head as a unit that attaches to the middle part of the body, the torso. Basically all the middle parts of the body connected to the spine. Now when you're talking about illustrated or cartoon characters, humanoid, hominoid type of bipedal characters, there's basically two types that you're going to tend to run into. One, like our hipster woman here, maybe the most common, is a character with a distinct neck and a separate head. So in this first lesson, we're going to be taking a look at that type of character. In our next lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the other type of character, which is a character with no neck, where the head simply merges right into the body. Classic example of this would be Fred Flintstone, or a more modern example would be Finn the Human or Jake the Dog from Adventure Time. Now the rigging for these type of characters is very similar, but there are some important and distinct differences between the two. So we'll look at those in the next lesson. In this lesson, where we look at characters with necks and separate heads, we're going to look at two different rigs. One using Duick's auto rig system, and one using a manual rig system. Now Duick Basil's auto rigging is really amazing, but I have to say that in the realm of torso rigging, I prefer the manual rig to the auto rig for a couple of important reasons. But we're going to take a look at both. Now in the arm and leg lessons, we talked a lot about the pros and cons of jointing versus puppet tooling limbs. In these torso lessons, we're not going to do any jointing at all, except for the joint between the separate head and the neck at the top of these first rigs we're going to look at. From the neck to the pelvis, we're going to be using the puppet tool entirely. In general, I don't recommend trying to joint a torso. Usually, torsos have fairly complicated artwork that makes it difficult to separate into separate layers. Buttons, ties, in this case a plaid stripe on her shirt, and even when the artwork isn't complicated, it's very difficult to divide up the pieces of a torso in a way that gives you those circular overlaps to get a wide range of motion. You often end up with sort of ovular overlaps or oddly shaped overlaps that tend not to look very good when they start to bend. Even the neck, which is perhaps the easiest element on the torso to separate and provide circular overlaps where it connects with the top of the chest, doesn't work very well because then you get a very stiff, straight neck when it bends. Using the puppet tool, you get a nice soft curve in the neck, which is much more natural and true to the way real necks bend. And in general, despite the puppet tool's quirks and shortcomings, the puppet tool really excels when it comes to torso rigging. Because the thing you need from a torso is a lot of soft deformation. You generally don't need super sharp bends like you do at an elbow or a knee. You generally need more subtle curvature to reflect the movement of the spine. And when you have that complicated artwork or the difficulty of creating effective overlaps by separating pieces, puppet tooling the torso from the pelvis up through the neck allows you to get a very natural and soft deformation that's very, very effective. So I pretty much always use the puppet tool when I rig torsos, and I recommend that you do too. Now, if you have a specific character with a design that really supports separating different pieces out, say like a robot or sort of an insect man with separated pieces, then you can go ahead and explore jointing. But I really wouldn't do that unless the jointing is actually adding something to your rig. In most cases, puppet tooling is the way to go. So let's get started with Hipster Woman Rig 1 here, and we're going to look at an auto-rigged spine. Let's start by just kind of taking a look at our artwork situation here. So go ahead and hit the Shy button to open up our layers. Note that we have our arms and legs already rigged. Note also that we're using these kind of separated controllers in this case, which actually fit very well for this particular character, given the size of her hands and feet, and the fact that there was sort of ample room to kind of place the controllers around her body here. Remember again that the placement of your controllers, the size of your controllers, is really up to you, but the consideration should always be what makes the animator's life easier, whether the animator is you or someone else. Now, most importantly, let's take a look at the torso here. Note that we have a single layer for the torso, all pre-composed together. So from the pelvis all the way up through the tip of the neck is all one piece of artwork that we're going to puppet tool. Note that our head and all of the facial pieces are also all pre-composed into one layer. If I had separate mouth shapes for different expressions, or separate eyelid pieces or eyebrow artwork, the glasses, the nose, all of the facial feature artwork should all be pre-composed together into one head composition. And again, we're going to look at facial rigging in upcoming lessons. Now, in this particular case, this character has slightly long hair, and the hair has to appear both in front of the face and behind the face. So we also have a separate back hair piece here, which is basically just the hair layer separated, and the headpiece sits on top and has the hair kind of cut off at the bottom. And you'll see why we did this once we get further into the rigging. But this is a very common situation for characters with longer hair, where the hair has to be in front of and behind the head and torso. Okay, let's go ahead and get set up to work here. What we're going to do is we're just going to solo the torso artwork to start with, and we're going to solo a couple of other key layers here that we need to use as guides, namely the structures of the thighs. So we want to turn on the thigh structures here and solo those, and the structures of the arms, the upper arms. Then let's go ahead and create our spinal structure for our torso rig. So let's go to structures here and to the spine, and we're going to go over to the spine options, and let's take a look at those. Now note that in the spine structures, we have a few different options here. We can either have a head structure or not have a head structure. We can have or not have a hip structure. And then we can have multiple layers for the neck or the spine. So if I want more than one neck layer here, I can type in and I can put in more than one neck layer. With the spine, I can have less or more spine layers. So I can really create exactly the kind of custom spine that I want. Now for this simple auto rig, the default of a head, a one-layer neck, a two-layer spine, and the hips will work just fine. So make sure you have those default settings and go ahead and hit create. Okay, let's go up and take a look at our structures here. We of course have the hips. There's our two spines, spine and spine 2. And then we have a neck structure, a head structure, and then we have a spine tip structure, which is again one of these little buttons right there at the end of the head. Now we need to go ahead and align our structure along our torso. Okay, to start with, I'm going to place the hips in between the two thigh structures. So I don't have to get super scientific about this. I can just eyeball this. I want to try to place that hip anchor point right in between the anchor points of those two thighs. Then I want to grab spine 1 here, and I want to bring that down. I'm holding down the shift key just to keep these aligned fairly straight. And I want to bring that down to basically the top of the pelvis. The hips are going to drive what is essentially the pelvis of the body, which is of course a kind of a bowl-shaped bone that sits in the bottom of all of our torsos. So we want spine 1, the anchor point of spine 1, to basically define the top of the pelvis. And in this case, I'm simply using the division between the pants and the shirt to define that point. Then I'm going to bring down spine 2, and I want to place spine 2 basically in the middle of the torso here, in the middle of the chest. You can kind of think of this position as being roughly the base of the rib cage, in between the base of the neck and the top of the pelvis. Then we're going to bring down the neck. And I held the shift key down to keep that straight, but we're now going to scooch this over a little bit, and we want to center that on the neck, and we want to place the anchor point basically right where the shoulders connect with the neck. I'm just going to nudge that over a little. Now, we've got this little bit of a jump here, moving from spine 2, which is in line with spine 1, and the neck, which is offset a little bit. So I'm going to grab spine 2, and I'm going to hit our toggle edit mode button to make that editable so it'll unparent anything parented to it, since we're happy with the placement of the neck here. So we'll go ahead and toggle edit mode, and then I'm just going to scooch it over just a few clicks just to kind of straighten that out so it's creating an even diagonal from spine 1 up to the neck. Then I'm going to make sure and toggle edit mode again. Really important to always remember to toggle off the edit mode after you've edited. Otherwise, it'll mess up your parenting and your rigging will get messed up. Okay, for the head, we want to go ahead and turn on this neck marker here at the tip of the neck. And we're going to want to snap this head to that. So that head is pivoting exactly on that circular overlap. We can go ahead and turn off that neck marker now. Now the spine tip does not have to be particularly precise. If we turn our head on here, we really just need that to be basically at the top of the head, which it is. Okay, so we've got our structure in place. Let's go ahead and grab our structure elements here, and let's click and drag them down and bring them down and put them above our head and torso artwork here. And let's color all of the layers except the head and spine tip purple to coincide with our torso artwork layer. And we'll leave the head and the spine tip blue since those correspond to our head layer. Okay, now we're ready to add our puppet pins to our torso artwork here. So let's unlock our torso comp layer, select that, and grab our puppet pin tool. And let's zoom in here so we can get nice, precise placement on these anchor points. Now remember that a puppet pin has no rotation value. And remember that when we rotate the pelvis control for this rig, we're going to want these hips to twist as if there's a pelvis bone in here, and we'll want the hips to go up and down as that rotates, and we'll want this piece of artwork to rotate as well. We also want to make sure that the legs move precisely along with this pelvis piece. So rather than placing a puppet pin here at the anchor point of the hip structure, instead we're going to place 2 anchor points on the right and left anchor points of the thighs to create right and left hip pins. So let's zoom in and do that. So we want one here on the right hip, and we want a pin here on the left hip. Remember, you want to zoom in and try to get these as dead centered as you can. So we make sure that as that pelvis is twisting, it's moving the hips and the pivot point for the upper parts of our legs. And remember that the deformation on the puppet tool is not particularly precise. And we want to make sure that these points of connection with the thighs and also the upper arms stay locked into place as this torso is deforming. These pins placed exactly at these pivot points will make sure that happens. Then we can go ahead and place pins up the spine right on these structures. So we're going to place a pin here at spine 1. And we're going to place a pin here at spine 2. And we're going to place a pin here at the base of the neck. And a pin up here at the tip of the neck where the head will connect to the neck. Now, just like with the hips, we want to make sure to lock into place these connection points with the upper arms. So again, as this torso is deforming, this point of connection does not sort of shift and drift around. So we also need a pin here at the right shoulder, and we need a pin at the left shoulder. So right and left hips, right and left shoulder, and then up through the spine to the top. The only one we skip here is the hips. Now, as always, let's change our puppet engine to Legacy, and we want to make sure that our triangles are at 1500 and our expansion is at 5. Let's hit the U key on this layer and name our puppet pins. Now I'm going to name these pins the same names as their corresponding structures, with of course the exception of the right and left hip and right and left shoulder. Once all of our pins are named, we're going to select them, go to Links and Constraints, and add our bones. Let's go ahead and color our bones purple, since these are really all part of the torso rigging specifically. Even though there's one called head, it's really all part of this torso rig. And we can go ahead and close up our torso comp layer there. Now, even though we could technically go ahead and parent these bones right into our structure before we begin our rigging, I'm going to hold off on that so we do all of the parenting all together, since the parenting is a little complicated with torso rigging. So let's start by auto-rigging our spine, getting the controllers set up, and then we'll do all the parenting all at once. So I'm going to turn off the visibility of everything except our structure layers here. And we can actually go ahead and turn off the visibility of the thighs and arms now, since we no longer need those to guide our puppet pins. And let's select our spine structure and go ahead and auto rig. Now, once you run the auto rig, you're going to get this kind of jumble of pictogram icons here. So let's start by getting these icons a little bit arranged so they're a little easier to see and work with. So first of all, we want to change the color of these controllers. Remember that in my color coding system, right is red, left is purple, and all centrally located controls will be green. So we're going to select all of these controllers all together. We're going to go to the Create Controllers button, and we're going to go down to Edit. We're going to click on Color, and we're going to select green. That will turn all of those controllers green. Now let's go through each controller and just arrange these, rename them, and then we can talk about what they do. Now, this initial arrangement we're going to do without the artwork visible, just so you can kind of see what's happening with the spinal rig before we start working with the artwork. Once we add the artwork back in, we're probably going to want to tweak these a little bit so they're arranged over the artwork in a reasonable way. Now let's start with this head controller, and let's also rename these as we go to make them a little simpler. And we're going to just call this head. And let's go ahead and make the opacity 25% like we've been doing. And let's move the position of this icon away from the head. So we're creating a kind of teacup handle controller style. In other words, the head will be here, but the controller for the head will be like the handle on a teacup off to the side. Now, the reason I like to do this is because I find it really distracting to have an icon sitting over the face of a character when I'm trying to create a performance with that character, especially if there's going to be facial expressions. But even without the facial expressions, I really don't want an icon sitting right over the face of my character. So we move that icon off to the side, and let's maybe just round this number up a little bit. And then we can still control that head with that icon, again, like a teacup handle. So you can see that this controller controls the rotation of the head. Once we're all done with our parenting, it will also control the position of the head. It doesn't actually do that right now, but we're going to fix that with our parenting. Let's move our head controller to the top of our stack here. Oh, and before we go much further, we should probably change these all to green so they're all color-coded in green. Then we have the shoulders and neck controller. I'm just going to simplify that to neck. Let's once again turn this down to 25%. And I'm going to leave this there for now. We'll probably tweak it a little once we turn the artwork on, but that one can stay right there. The spine curve control will also leave in the middle. We'll just turn that opacity down. We might play around with that size once we get the artwork on, but let's wait until we get a little farther in. And let's change the name of this controller to mid, since it's controlling the middle of the body. That'll just simplify that naming a little bit. Now the spine root control is one that we're actually going to eventually turn off. We're going to turn off the visibility of this spine root. It's really not necessary as a click and drag controller. So I'm just going to move that down under these other controllers and turn its visibility off for now. The hip control, which is this pelvis icon, we're going to turn this again to 25%. And again, we'll leave this one in place. We might scooch it around a little once we get everything turned back on. And let's rename that pelvis. Now, you can call this hips if you want, or hip. You can really call it whatever you like. I like pelvis, but that's really up to you. Now we have this controller here, the body controller. This controller basically moves the entire upper part of the body. And again, if you want to name it body, you can. But I prefer to use the term that's usually used in 3D rigging, which is center of gravity, or COG, the cog. And this is another controller that I'm going to move away from the body and position in a teacup handle style. In fact, let's put it roughly the same distance out from the head. And we can adjust these a little bit once we get a little farther. And we'll turn that opacity down as well. Now, while we've got just our controllers and our spine structure visible, I want to kind of walk through the controls and talk about what's happening so you have a clear idea of how this works. But we don't want to start playing around with these too much until we've zeroed out our controllers. Otherwise, we may lose these important neutral positions here. So let's real quick walk through and select each one of these and zero them out. Now, we don't need to zero out the spine root because this won't actually be used in animation. Okay, once all of our controllers are zeroed out, let's kind of walk through these really quick, and then we'll start parenting everything up. So again, we looked at what the head controller does. It rotates the head. It'll eventually also control the position of the head. Now, the neck control, when we click and drag on that, notice that that moves the head and the head controller. And it also kind of softly bends the spine in the middle. We can also rotate this neck control. And notice it rotates the neck, but keeps the head straight up right now. Again, we're going to change that just a little bit once we get a little farther. Now let's jump down to the pelvis control. And when you click and drag on the pelvis control, notice that it also creates this soft curve in the middle of the spine, as it does when you rotate the pelvis as well. Also note as we rotate the pelvis, it shifts the neck and head just a little bit. Now this soft curve between this pelvis and this neck piece that we're creating here, this is what's called a Bezier IK. If we go into the auto rig options here, you'll see it's a manual rigging option, and it's shown as this little soft bendy curve, which is exactly what the Bezier IK does. It's very similar to a regular IK in that there's a top part of the chain and a bottom part of the chain, but the difference is rather than creating a sharp elbow or knee bend in the middle, it creates these soft curves. If I simply move one piece closer to another, notice how it just sort of stretches like a rubber band in the middle. And if I move it side to side or rotate it, it creates a soft curvature. That's the Bezier-IK. It's perfect for things like spines, tails, long giraffe necks, that sort of thing. We're going to look a little more closely at the Bezier-IK when we look at quadrupeds. Now, as part of the Bezier-IK rigging, we get this central control, the mid control. Duick-Basel calls it a curve control. And when we click and drag on that, notice it shapes the curve in the middle between the upper and lower parts of the IK chain. So this will allow us, for example, if we twist the pelvis and we bend the neck a little bit, then we can pull out this curve control and create a soft, curved bend to the spine. As we've already looked at, the cog control controls this whole upper part of the body and moves it around as a unit. In other words, it's controlling the center of gravity of the character, the heaviest part of the character, the torso, and up through the head. Now, this is a fairly effective rigging system, but it does have some distinct drawbacks, which is why I'm going to show you a manually rigged spine that I think corrects some of the disadvantages of this auto-rigged spine. But let's talk more about that once we get this all parented up and put together. Now, let's also take these centrally located green controllers here, and let's move them down underneath our hand and foot controllers. I like the controller stack to reflect the artwork stack that we have here. And because this is a forward-facing character, the arms and the legs sit on top of the torso. The arms are at the topmost layer, the legs underneath the arms, and then the torso and head underneath the arms and legs. If we were working with a 3/4 character, we would place these central controllers in between the right or left hand and feet, depending on which were more forward-facing. We'll look at a situation like that in our next lesson. All right, let's go ahead and get this all parented up, and we can take a look at how this rig works with the artwork. So let's start with our bones. First, the right and left hip bones will be parented to the hips structure. Spine 1 will be parented to spine 1, spine 2 to spine 2, the neck to the neck, and the head to the head. Now the shoulders, the right and left shoulders, those are going to be parented to the neck structure. Because remember, the neck controller was originally called the neck and shoulders controller, and it's meant to control both the neck and the shoulders all together. So the left and right shoulder bones to the neck structure. Let's also make sure that our torso artwork layer is parented into our system. Remember again, we want the artwork layers to stay as close to the puppet pins as they possibly can. But rather than parent the torso artwork layer to any of these structures, like say the hips, but we're not going to parent the torso artwork layer to any of these structure layers. You might be thinking, well, can't we parent it to the hips? But the problem is the hips are going to rotate independently of the rest of this structure, which means that even a small rotation on the hips would pitch the artwork off and away from these puppet pins, potentially causing some drift. So instead, we're going to parent the torso artwork layer to the center of gravity, to the cog, because when the center of gravity rotates or moves position, it's moving that whole upper part of the body, and it should move that torso artwork along with it. That'll keep the pins as close to that artwork layer as possible. So torso artwork to the cog. Now, as we noted before, the head controller right now controls the rotation of the head structure, but it does not control the position of the head structure. And I like a head control to both control rotation and position so that you can, for example, scrunch the head down towards the shoulders a little bit or shift the head back and forth on the neck a little bit. Just gives you a lot more expressive capabilities. So note that the head controller is parented to the neck controller. We're looking at the zero out null here, but the head controller is parented to the zero out null, which is then parented to the neck controller. So whatever the neck controller does, the head controller does. So we want to make sure that what the head controller does, the head artwork does. So the first thing we're going to do is parent the head artwork along with the back hair artwork that we basically just need to treat as the same as the head artwork. We want to parent both of these to the head structure. We can turn them on too. Then we want to take the head structure and change its parenting. So rather than being parented directly to the neck structure, we're going to parent the head structure to the head controller. So now when we click and drag on the head controller, you can see that it moves not just the rotation of the head. Also note it brings the artwork at the tip of the neck along with the head, so the head and the neck stay connected because the head bone there at the tip of the neck is parented also to this head structure. So the head always stays connected to the neck, but we can move the head independently. But it also means that when we move the neck control, all of that moves together because the head controller is parented back to that neck control. So that gives us a really nice effective control there. Now the last thing we want to parent in here are our arms and legs so we complete this full body rig. So let's start by turning off our solo buttons here. Let's get all of our artwork on. And you can see we're going to need to reposition these controllers a little bit, but we'll do that in a second. Let's turn off the visibility of our bones and our structure. We don't really need those. And then let's parent in our arms and legs. So let's start with the arm structures. So I'm going to unlock our two arm structures here, the upper arms. We're going to select those. And we're going to parent the upper arms, the arm structures, to the neck structure. Because again, remember our neck controller, which is controlling that neck structure, is also meant to control our shoulders. So we're going to parent the upper arms to the neck. Can lock those back up again. Then we want to grab our two thigh structures. And the thigh structures we're going to parent to the hip structures. Let's lock those back up again. And now when we click and drag and move around our cog controller to move the center of gravity, you can see that the arms and legs are now connected. When we grab the neck controller, you can see that the shoulders are connected. And the hip controller, how the upper legs are connected there. When we twist and rotate the hips, we get that nice shifting in the pelvis, moving the legs up and down just the way we would want it to. Okay, let's adjust the appearance of these controllers just a little bit more. Clean this up just a little bit. So the head controller, I think, should be a little farther out. Let's put it out a little farther so there's some room for the arms and legs here. So let's round this off to about 600. The neck controller is actually in a pretty okay place, but I'm just going to bring it down just a little so it's not interfering with the face quite so much. Let's round that number off as well. The mid controller, I'm just going to make a little bit larger, not too much larger there, but just a little bit bigger. Let's round that off to 400. And then the pelvis, let's move that up over the pelvis just a little bit more. Round that off to minus 100. And then the cog control, let's also bring that out a little further. And let's size that up a little bit since this is kind of an important control. And then finally on this spine root, which is not going to be one of our click and drag controls, it does have the display options with the draw guides checkbox that's showing us this little string, this little kind of rubber band showing us the Bezier IK connection there. Now I would recommend unchecking this just to clean up your rig a little bit. Unfortunately, I'm experiencing a little bug with this particular version of Duick Basel I have. My guess is by the time you are working with this bug will be fixed. So I would recommend unchecking that. That'll get rid of that little string once this bug is fixed, and it'll just clean up your rig a little bit. Whoops, Morgan cutting in here with a little correction to what I just said. This isn't actually a bug, it's just an extraneous display checkbox that doesn't need to be here. And again, with the current version of Duick Basel you are probably using, this is probably no longer here. But the actual draw guides for this little string guide is here on the mid controller under Bezier IK. There it is, draw guides. And we can actually check that off and clean up this rig a little bit. Now, I didn't discover this until after I recorded the lesson, so you'll still see my little string showing up in the rest of this lesson, but that's how you get rid of it. Under mid, Bezier IK, uncheck draw guides, it works just fine. I just got a little confused by this extra one down here. Okay, back to the lesson. Now we also want to add a little starch here. Notice when we twist the neck, we get these kind of wavy, soft, squishy shoulders here. And we're also getting a little bit of squishiness in the pelvis. It's not too bad, but I might put a little starch in the pelvis too. So let's maybe twist this neck just a little so we can see that kind of wavy problem that we want to fix. Let's go down to our torso artwork layer, hit the E key, select the puppet, and grab our puppet starch tool. And let's zoom in here, and let's start with a little starch on these shoulders. You can see how that straightened that out. That's probably more than we need. Let's turn this down a little. Maybe something like that. And we'll put a little starch over here. And there we go. Now we're keeping those shoulders a little straighter. Let's straighten that neck back out. And now shift the pelvis a little, and let's see if we can clean this up a little bit as well. Actually, it's not too bad. Well, we maybe don't need to do much there, but let's just see if a little starch improves things down in that pelvis area. Yeah, that keeps it just a little more solid there, just a little bit less squishy. That's probably all that we need. Okay, let's just do some of our normal cleanup steps here. We'll shy away those layers. We'll lock all these up. Let's shy our spine root layer here and lock that as well. And then hit our shy button. Okay, again, a really decent, effective rig here, but I do have some issues with it. And the issues are centered mostly around this neck controller. I find it fairly restrictive that every time you rotate the neck, you also rotate the shoulders. This makes it impossible to have individual control over the neck bending. You can, of course, rotate the head off the end of the neck, but that's only part of how you position a head and a neck. The neck bends where it meets the top of the chest, and the head rotates off of the tip of the neck. And I would like to have control over both of those without having to also shift my shoulders. It's also not very anatomically correct. We have this sort of squishy middle, and then we can click and drag on the shoulders and the neck up at the top here. But that's not really the way the human body works. We have a rib cage. So just like the pelvis is a essentially solid bone sitting at the base of the torso, the rib cage is essentially a solid bone structure at the top of the torso. Now I know what you're saying. It's not completely solid. It expands and contracts when we breathe, and it does flex a little bit when we bend our spine, but not a whole lot. It's relatively solid up in here. And the bendy part of our torso is really in between the top of the pelvis and the bottom of the rib cage in the middle here, where our guts and squishy bits are. So I prefer to have a pelvis control and a chest control that controls essentially the rib cage, with the shoulders attached to that rib cage, and then an individual control over the neck. To me, this gives me a greater range of possibilities for poses and is more anatomically correct. Now, manual rigging is always a little more work than auto rigging, but not really a whole lot, as I think you'll see. Many of the steps are exactly the same. There is a little bit of extra work manually creating some controllers and a little bit of extra parenting, but I think it's a much more effective way to rig a torso. Now, the advantage to this kind of auto rigging, of course, is you save those steps, but it's really only a few steps that you're saving. The other disadvantage, of course, is that you don't get to choose your controllers, whereas with the manual rig, you have a little more control over that as well. So spend a little time playing around with this rig system and see the things that you like about it and don't like about it. And then once we create the manually rigged torso, you can compare and contrast their pros and cons. So let's move over to Hipster Woman Rig 2, and let's take a look at how we can manually rig a torso to have a pelvis and a chest control with individual control over the neck. Now note that we're in exactly the same situation we started with the first rig. We've got the right and left arms all rigged, and we have exactly the same artwork situation with the single pre-comped layer for the torso from the pelvis up through the top of the neck, single pre-comped layer for the head, and the additional back hair piece. So everything is exactly the same as where we started with rig 1. And we're going to start the same way too, by soloing the torso, arm, and thigh structures. Now let's go again to our Create Structures tab, and let's go down to Spine and Spine Options here, and we're just going to make one small change, which is we're going to add one additional spine layer. This will allow us to have that separate chest control that we talked about. Essentially, that third spine layer is going to be our chest or our rib cage structure. And let's go ahead and create that structure. So you can see it's exactly the same as what we did before. It's just got that one additional spine, spine 3. Let's go ahead and move these down into place above our torso and head artwork here. Let's color these purple, but as before, we'll just change the head and spine tip to blue since those correspond to the head artwork. If you wanted to actually move the purple torso pieces above the torso artwork and leave the head pieces above the head artwork, I'm leaving all the structures together just to make it a little easier to follow when we do the parenting. But again, organize however it makes the most sense to you. Okay, and let's go ahead and align our structure. And this is going to be, again, very, very similar, just with a couple small differences. As before, we're going to place the hips structure in between our two thigh structures. And as before, we're going to take spine 1 and we're going to move that right to the top of the pelvis using the separation between the pants and the shirt. Now things are just going to get a little bit different. We're going to take spine 2 And we're going to kind of move that down roughly in sort of the belly button kind of an area. And we'll probably adjust this again once we position spine 3. So we'll just kind of roughly position spine 2. And then let's go up and grab spine 3 and bring that down. And what we want to do with spine 3 is we want to define essentially the bottom of the rib cage. So if we think about our human anatomy here just a little bit, we have the pelvis sitting at the bottom of the torso, which is this kind of bowl-shaped bone. And then we have the rib cage up at the top of the torso, which is a somewhat flexible but mostly solid cage of bones. It expands and contracts a little bit when we breathe, and it bends just a little bit as we bend our spine. But for the most part, and certainly when we're talking about rigging characters, it's essentially a solid piece. In between the bottom of the rib cage and the top of the pelvis is just a stretch of spine and a lot of squishy bits in our guts there in the middle. And that's really where most of the bending happens in a torso, between the top of the pelvis and the bottom of the rib cage. So we're looking to sort of define that here with our structures. And spine 3, our structure spine 3, is going to define that rib cage area. Now, when we're dealing with cartoon characters, I usually like to keep the rib cage a little bit short, so the bottom of the rib cage is a little bit on the high side, just so we have ample room for flexing in the middle of the torso. So I'm going to put it about there. And then now what I want to do is I want to go back and look at spine 2, and I want to make sure that spine 2 is roughly in between spine 3 and spine 1. And it looks like I want to scooch that down just a little bit, so I'm going to toggle edit mode. That way I won't move the chest piece that we just placed. And I'm just going to scooch that down a couple of clicks. And again, you don't have to be scientific about it, just kind of eyeball it, but roughly in between spine 1 and spine 3. Remember to toggle your edit mode back off. That's very important to make sure that you don't mess up your parenting, which will make a mess of your rigging. Let's continue on now with the neck. And just like before, we're going to kind of go back to doing things just like we did before. We want to place the neck in the center of the neck and basically right where the shoulders meet the base of the neck. Once we have that in place, let's go back real quick and just have a look at what's happening with the little offset here, because the neck is offset a little bit here from our straight spine coming up here. So let's just grab each of these and just scooch them over a little. So I'm going to grab spine 3, toggle edit mode, and just scooch that over a couple of clicks. Toggle the edit mode again. Then I'm going to grab spine 2, again, toggle edit mode, and just scooch that over a click or two. Maybe just one click over. Toggle edit mode again. And what we're just trying to do is just trying to create a sort of smooth diagonal shift as we go up to the neck. And again, I'm just eyeballing this. Now, just like we did before, we want to turn on that neck marker, or head marker really, and we want to snap that head structure to that marker. As before, we don't have to be real precise where the spine tip sits, as long as it sits near the top of the head. Okay, now that we've got our spine in place, we're ready to set our puppet pins. Now we're going to do this in exactly the same way we did before. The only difference is we have that one additional spine structure. So let's unlock our torso comp layer here, select that, go up and grab our puppet pin tool, and let's zoom in here. We want to get nice and accurate right on these anchor points. So just like before, we want right and left hip pins. Just as before, we're going to skip the hips structure, and we'll start here at spine 1, and then go right up the spine, spine 2, spine 3, the neck, and then the spine tip where the head attaches. Then we want the right shoulder, and the left shoulder. So no big surprises here. We've just got that one additional structure element in the spine, so that gives us one additional puppet pin there. And just like before, we're going to change our puppet engine to legacy, making sure our triangles are at 1500, our expansion is at 5. Then we're going to hit the U key, and we're going to name our pins. And again, there's going to be no surprises here. We'll just name the pins based on their corresponding structure, with the exception of the right and left hip and the right and left shoulder. Once we've named our pins, we'll go ahead and select them, go over to Links and Constraints, and add our bones. And let's color those bones purple. Now, because we're manually rigging this torso, we're going to need to manually create most of our controllers. So let's go ahead and turn off the visibility of these bones. We really don't need to look at those little push pin icons, and it'll allow us to see what we're doing a little bit better here. And let's begin by selecting the hips structure. Now, the first thing we want is a controller sharing the same anchor point as the hips to be our center of gravity. So let's go to our Create Controllers tab, and let's grab one of these rotation and position icons, and we'll click that to create a controller there with the same anchor point as the hips. Now this is going to be our cog, so let's name that COG for center of gravity. And then let's move that icon away from the body in that kind of teacup handle style we've been working with here. So I'm just going to kind of guesstimate this, and we can come back and adjust it later if we feel like we need to. And I'm also going to move that up so it's sitting roughly in the middle of the torso vertically. We'll just round that up. And let's increase the size a little bit too. Maybe scooch that out just a little bit more now that it's a little bit larger. And of course, we'll turn the opacity down. Now at that same anchor point, we need yet another controller. Now I could just go ahead and leave the cog selected there. I'm going to select the hips again just to make it clear that what we're doing is creating two controllers sharing the same anchor point as the hips. And this will be our pelvis controller. So with those hips selected, or you could have the cog selected too, we'll go ahead and add another controller right there. And we'll just leave this where it is. And it's actually a pretty decent size just the way it is too. So let's just go ahead and turn that opacity down. And let's go ahead and name that. Now we also need a controller for the head. So let's go ahead and select the head structure. So we create a controller with the same anchor point as the head. And let's add another controller right there. And let's try positioning that controller about the same distance out from the body as our cog controller. So those line up nicely. And I'm just going to temporarily turn on the head artwork. And let's move that head controller up a little bit. So it's again sort of centered vertically next to the head. And I think again that size works just fine, and we'll turn the opacity down. Let's go ahead and name that head. All right, now we still need a chest controller and a midsection controller, but these are going to be created for us when we add our Bezier IK to our spine. So let's turn off the visibility of the head really quick, and let's think about this a little bit. Now the difference again with this manual rig is that we're going to have sort of a solid rib cage area and sort of a solid pelvis area. And again, the bendy, squishy parts are going to be in between the top of the pelvis and the bottom of the rib cage. So unlike the auto rig, where everything from the neck down to the top of the pelvis has that stretchy, bendy Bezier IK, in this case, we only want that stretchy part between spine 3 and spine 1 sitting at the top of the pelvis. And we're, of course, going to be manually rigging the Bezier IK rather than letting the auto rig do it for us. So if we want that Bezier IK between spine 3 and spine 1, we simply select spine 3, spine 2, and spine 1. And then we go to Links and Constraints, to Auto Rig Options, and then under IK and FK, choose Bezier IK. And you'll see that adds 3 controllers, 2 of which we will use as visible click and drag controllers, and the third, the root controller, will hide away just like we did with the auto rig. So let's get these named and positioned a little better. Our main controller here, now called spine, is going to be our chest control. So let's name that. And let's move that up a little bit. The anchor point, of course, is at the base of spine 3. Let's move that up until the bottom of the icon is basically sitting at that anchor point. We can round this off here. And I think the size works just fine. And we'll turn down that opacity. Now the spine 2 curve, which sits right in the middle there, that's going to be our mid controller. And we can leave that where it is. Let's maybe just size it up just a hair more, not too much. And let's uncheck draw guides just to keep this rig a little cleaner and turn the opacity down. And then the spine root, of course, will not be a visible click and drag, so I'm going to move that down the bottom of the stack, and I'm just going to turn the visibility off on that. Now we don't have this all hooked up yet, but just note that now when I click and drag this chest control, you can see it's moving the entire upper part of the torso from that spine 3 structure upward, which gives us that solid rib cage feeling at the top there. Bezier IK in the middle, which corresponds to the bendy, squishy part in the middle of a humanoid torso. So this is where we get that more anatomically correct rigging to the torso, which is why I really like manually rigging instead of using the auto rig for this. Okay, let's go ahead and reorder these controllers a little bit. Let's put the head on top. So it kind of runs down head, chest, mid, pelvis, and then the cog. And then the root can just sit at the bottom there. And then let's also grab these and move them once again below our hand and foot controllers, since that reflects the artwork stack. Okay, we've got our structures, our puppet pins, and our controllers all set. Let's go ahead and parent this all together. So let's begin with our bones. And just like with our previous rig, for the most part, our bones are just going to be parented right to their corresponding structures. The only real difference is going to be with the shoulders. So let's start with the right and left hip bones. Those are going to be parented to the hip structure. Spine 1, 2, and 3 bones are just going to be parented to the spine 1, 2, and 3 structures. The neck bone to the neck structure, the head bone to the head structure. And now here's where things get just a little bit different. The right and left shoulder bones, rather than moving with the neck, those are now going to want to move with our chest structure, which is spine 3. So when we move the chest, it moves the shoulders. And again, this reflects anatomy. Your shoulders are connected up at the top of your rib cage. When your rib cage moves, your shoulders move. So we'll parent those shoulder bones to spine 3. And you want to just kind of get into the habit now of thinking of spine 3 as the chest structure or the rib cage. Okay, now we have our bones parented. Let's parent in our artwork layers. So I'm going to unlock the head and the back hair here. The torso artwork, we're going to parent, as we did before, to the cog to once again keep the artwork layer as close to the puppet pins as possible as things start to move around. The head and its corresponding back hair comp here, those quite obviously are going to be parented to the head structure. Now we need to do just a little parenting with our structures here. Starting with the hips, we need to connect the hip structure, which is sort of the base of the spine, into our overall rigging system here. So we need to take the hips and parent those to the pelvis controller. Now spine 2, and spine 3 are already connected to the chest controller and the root controller via the Bezier IK rigging. But we also want to have that individual control over the head, just like we had in the auto rig. So we need to create that same kind of parenting loop we created in the auto rig. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the head structure, and note of course that the head structure is parented back to the neck structure. So we're going to take the head structure and parent it first to the head controller. So now when we move the head controller, it'll move that head structure and the head artwork. But we also want the head to move when we move the neck or we move the chest. And remember, the head structure was originally parented to the neck. So we want to keep that relationship. We're just inserting the head controller into that. So we want to now go to the head controller, and we want to parent the head controller back to the neck structure. And that again creates that parenting loop so that all of our other rigging will work normally, but we'll be able to have individual control over the position and rotation of the head. And before we finish up parenting the controllers, let's go ahead and parent in our arms and legs. So let's start with the right and left arms here, and we'll kind of turn off their visibility as we parent these in. So let's unlock the right and left arm structures and select those. And this is again a little different. Just like we did with the shoulder bones, we want the upper arms also parented to the chest or the rib cage, which of course is spine 3. So the right and left arm structures to the spine 3 structure. Let's go ahead and turn off the visibility of those layers and lock those back up. And then let's grab the right and left thigh structures. And no surprises there. Those are going to be parented to the hips structure, just as you'd expect. So no difference there. Let's turn off the visibility of those and lock those up. Okay, we just have a little more parenting to do with our controllers. So first off, our invisible spine 2 root controller here, we need to also get that parented into our system. And remember, that's now controlling the bottom of our Bezier IK chain here. And so that needs to be parented to, again, the pelvis. So when we move the pelvis, it moves the hips, and it also moves the bottom of our Bezier IK chain. Then we need to make sure that when we move the cog, the center of gravity, it moves this whole system. So we want our chest, mid, and pelvis controls all parented to the cog. And remember, the head is already parented to the chest via the neck. So the head controller is parented to the neck structure. The neck structure is parented to the spine 3 structure. The spine 3 structure is parented to the chest controller. So that's already connected in here. But we need the chest, mid, and pelvis now parented to the cog that also brings the head and all of that stuff into the whole structure. Now once we've done that and we've got these all parented, we want to make sure and zero out all of these controllers before we start mucking around with them. So let's select each one in turn and zero these out. Now at this point we can probably turn off our solo buttons, get our artwork on, and do sort of an initial cleanup here. We just have a few more steps in our process here. Let's go ahead and turn off the visibility of our structure layers. Now remember that one of the advantages to this manual rig is that now that the chest controls the movement of our shoulders, we can now have individual control over the neck itself. So we need to add that control. So let's select the chest controller here, and let's close these up a little to make a little more room. And let's go under Effect, Expression Controls, and let's add an angle control. And we'll go ahead and just call that neck. And let's move that neck controller up above the rest of our controls here. And then let's lock our effect control window. Now we just need to find the neck structure right here. Select that, hit the R key for rotation, and again grab that property pick whip. If you're using an older version of After Effects, You're going to need to option click on the rotation stopwatch to engage expressions and then use the expression pick whip. But with CC 2018, we can just grab the property pick whip and connect right to that angle control. Now we can tilt that neck with that angle control independently of the shoulders and the chest. Now note also, you can now see why we needed to have that hair sitting behind the head, because the head itself needed to be in front of the torso, so it sits in front of the neck. But we also need to have the head behind the arms. So when we bring, for example, the hand up to the face for a gesture, that arm and hand need to be in front of the face. But if we had the back hair on that same layer, then the back hair would be sitting in front of the torso, but behind the arm. Now, this is why in the prepping lessons, we talk quite a bit about keeping layering very simple. But even when you keep your layering simple, you're bound to run into little tangly issues like this here. So in this case, the best solution was to put this only slightly longer hair on a separate layer to sit behind the head and behind the torso so that it can be behind the arm. So when we tilt the head, that hair goes behind the arm and the torso in a realistic looking way. The head can be in front of the neck the way it's supposed to, and the arms can be in front of the face. So it's important to remember when you are prepping your artwork to not just think about what your character looks like static. You have to think about what's going to happen when the character starts moving and how those layers are going to start to interact in motion. Now, the more rigging you do, the easier it will be to see these potential problems. But even when you have a lot of experience, you're going to be surprised by things. I was surprised by this little hair issue. I didn't see that coming, and I had to come up with a solution on the fly. But that's just in the nature of 2D character rigging. The more you can think it through in the prepping stage, however, the fewer of these little issues you're going to run into. Okay, before we finish up here, we discovered that we needed some starching in our previous rig. So we can pretty much assume that the same starching is going to be needed here. So I'm just going to really quickly duplicate basically the same starching we had in the previous rig. Now, I'd probably ordinarily take a little more time to monkey around and test things out, but just to save time, we'll just kind of duplicate the same basic starch situation we had before. So I'm going to select the torso comp, hit the E key, go up and grab our puppet starch tool, select our puppet effect, and we'll start with just a blob of starch down here at the bottom of the torso. And then let's put a couple of blobs up here in the shoulders, just to hold those shoulders steady. Oh, and we need to unlock our effects control window here. I always forget to do that. Okay, let's go ahead and finish our cleanup. Then we can play around with the rig a little bit and see what we've got. Let's shy away all of these layers and lock them up. We also want to shy away our spine to root, and we want to lock that up. And then we can shy all that mess away so we just have our controllers visible in the timeline. Okay, so a really nice effective rig here, and we've made, I think, some improvement by manually rigging this so we have this chest control. Everything else works pretty much the same. We can rotate the head at the tip of the neck, and we can move its position, and that tip of that neck moves along with it. We now have this chest control that allows us to bend the torso as if there's a rib cage at the top, and you can see how it gives us that effect as we rotate that chest control. We can also move the position of the chest control as well, and it gives us that real clear sense of that rib cage within the skeletal structure of our character. And we have this individual neck control. So we have control both over the position of the chest, which positions the shoulders, and the neck. Our midsection controller does the same thing as the other midsection and just controls the curvature of the spine as we're posing the torso. The pelvis control allows us to, of course, rotate the pelvis and the hips and move the position of the pelvis and the hips as well. And then the cog control controls the whole upper part of the body, the center of gravity, all the way from the pelvis upward. So to me, this is a more natural and intuitive way to pose a torso. We have that individual control over the neck, which gives us more posing possibilities. It's definitely a few more steps than the auto rig, but not really that many more, and we've gained some real clear advantages with those additional steps. Now remember that for all of these rigs, our cheat sheet PDF will help you with the details, especially the parenting, which I know can get a little bit confusing. So refer back to that PDF document when you're rigging your own characters. I recommend that you play around with this torso rig a little bit, and then play around with the auto rig we created earlier, and get a sense of which one you like better. But before we move on, I'd like to add one more level of control to this character, and that is some individual control over the shoulders. Individual shoulder control can really make your character a lot more expressive. The relationship between the shoulders and the neck and the head tell us a tremendous amount about what a character is feeling and thinking and what the character's attitude is. So your character is going to be a lot more expressive with individual shoulder control. Additionally, having some individual control over the shoulders can really help with more athletic or more complex movements. And it's really a very easy thing to rig. Now remember that when we looked at the arm structure options, there was an option to add a shoulder structure. This can be really useful for quadruped rigging, but I don't generally recommend it for humanoid characters. With a shoulder structure element, you'd only be able to pivot the shoulder up and down, but the human shoulder has a much greater range of motion than that. As you're sitting in your chair right now, try wiggling your shoulder around. It can move up and down, back and forth, and rotates all around. So I prefer a more free-form rig for shoulders in most cases. So let's add some shoulder control to this character. So let's go ahead and unshy our layers again. And let's start with the right shoulder. So let's find the right arm structure right here. Let's go ahead and unlock that. And let's just temporarily turn the visibility on there so we can kind of see what's happening here. And what we want to do is, with that right arm structure selected, we want to go to our Create Controllers tab, and we want to create just a null controller right here. So let's click that, and that's just going to give us a null object right at that same anchor point. And let's bring that down and move that right above our arm structure. Now this control is going to control both the upper part of the arm and the shoulder bone, but I'm going to position it here by the arm. We could position it down by the shoulder bone if we wanted to. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and turn that red since it's going to be part of the right arm rigging here. Now let's note that the right arm structure is parented to spine 3, and the right shoulder structure is also parented to spine 3, all to that chest structure, spine 3. So what we're going to do is we're going to unlock and select the right shoulder bone, and we're also going to select the right arm structure, and we're going to parent both of those to this new null controller that we've created. Now, in order to make sure the rest of our rigging works normally, we're again creating a little parenting loop here. We're going to parent this right arm controller back to spine 3. So again, our upper arm and our shoulder bone are still parented to spine 3. It's just via this new controller null that we've added that allows the rest of our rigging to work normally, but allows us to have individual control over this shoulder. So now if we move this controller, you can see it's moving not only the upper part of the arm, but it's also moving the shoulder portion of the torso artwork. Now that we've got that parented in, let's hit the P key for position here, and let's go to links and constraints, and we're going to zero out the position of this null controller. Now let's go back to the right-hand controller, and let's make a little room here. So I'm going to close up just the little angle controls here so they're just numeric, and I'm going to close up these controls as well just to kind of give us a little more room to work. And I'm going to add, under expression controls, a point control to this right-hand controller. Now, a point control is just like a position control. It has an X and a Y value. And let's call this right shoulder. Let's move that just underneath our finger controls. And then let's also zero out the value of this point controller. We'll just type zeros in for both the X and Y. Then we can lock our effects control window. And again, just take our property pick whip, or if you're using an older version of After Effects, option click and use the expression pick whip. And we're just going to connect this zeroed out position value direct to this zeroed out point controller. Now the point controller will now drive the position of this shoulder right from our hand control. Okay, let's go ahead and close this up. Turn off the visibility of both the structure and that null. Lock those back up and unlock our effects control window. Oh, and we also need to shy away that new null object we created. All right, let's repeat the process quickly with the left arm here, just so you can see how this goes one more time. So again, let's go down to the left arm structure. Let's unlock that. Oh, it looks like we accidentally left it on. I didn't see that. It's almost the same color as the shirt there. We'll make sure and turn that off once we're done. So we're going to select that left arm structure. Again, we're going to go to Create Controllers, and we're going to add a null controller there. Let's bring that controller down. Just put it above the arm, and we'll color it orange. And just like before, we're going to parent both the arm structure and the left shoulder to that left arm controller. Then we're going to take the left arm controller and parent that back to spine 3. We should lock these shoulder bones again. Then we can hit the P key and zero out the position of that controller. Let's go to the left hand control. Let's again make a little room here. And we'll add our point control. Name that left shoulder. Move that underneath the fingers, zero it out. Lock our effects control window and connect that point control to the position of the shoulder. Now again, we have individual control over this shoulder, but all of our other rigging works exactly the same. The shoulders are still connected in to the rest of the rig in the same way because of that little parenting loop we created. So a really nice control to add to your character, really adds a lot of expressive capability, and it's really not very difficult to add in. Let's make sure everything's closed and locked up here, and we'll shy this back away. Now remember that we can add this exact same shoulder control to our auto rig. There's no reason why we can't do that. The only difference, and it's just one small difference, is that those nulls you create at the shoulders are going to be parented to the neck rather than to spine 3. Of course, there isn't a spine 3 in the auto rig that we created, but more importantly, we want the shoulders in that rig to move with the neck controller. So you're just going to parent the shoulder bones and the upper arms back to the neck rather than to spine 3 that we did here in the manual rig. That's the only difference. Other than that, the procedure is exactly the same. And again, we'll have this all written out on the cheat sheet PDF for this lesson. Okay, we've got a terrific torso rig for this character, and with the right and left arms and legs rigged in, we've got a great full body rig here. Now before we move on to the next lesson, just want to take a look at one issue with torso rigging that you need to be aware of. So let's go to curved spine rig 1. And you'll see we have a spine set up for auto rigging. So this is the standard spinal structure that we used in our auto rig with a head and 2 spine layers. And you can see it's got a curve to it. The characters that we've been working with are sort of ideally suited to torso rigging because they have nice straight backs. But what if you're rigging like, say, a gorilla that's all sort of hunched over, or an old man or something like that, where there's a natural curve to the spine in their neutral state? In that case, you're going to see that a manually rigged spine is going to offer some advantages that an auto-rigged spine is not. But both can be dealt with in different ways. So the issue is when we do a Bezier IK rig, whether it's done in an auto rig setup or whether it's done manually, the Bezier IK is going to act like it's stretched a rubber band between the top and bottom of the IK chain, and it's going to pull any curved structures straight. And that can cause some problems when you're doing your rigging. So let's take a look at this. So imagine that this is our spine, and we've set our puppet pins along this spine, and then we go and do our auto rig. So let's select this and auto rig it. Okay, do you see what happened there? Everything stayed in the same place with the exception of the spine 2 anchor point, which was snapped straight in between spine 1 and the neck. So you can see the issue here, that if your puppet pin was out there, placed where that anchor point used to be, that anchor point is now moved substantially. Now the first thing is, if you had parented your bones before you ran the auto rig, it's literally going to jerk that part of your character forward and deform the way your character looks. You can certainly avoid that by waiting to parent your bones until after you've run the auto rig, which is what we did in these lessons. But you're still going to have the issue of this controller and this structure moving substantially away from where your actual puppet pin is, which could potentially create some strange behaviors and some deformations that you wouldn't actually want. Now, with a manually rigged spine, there's actually a pretty decent solution to this, which is we can simply reposition the mid-controller until it brings that back to where your puppet pin is, and then zero out that controller. The problem is, with an auto-rigged spine, when we move that mid-controller, it actually shifts the position of the neck and the head structures. So let's look at that. So see, as I pull that, notice that the neck and the head both move out of position. So that could potentially create quite a mess, because now the point at which my head controller is rotating is not actually where my head is actually rotating, and so on. You could run into some tricky situations there. So if you're planning on auto rigging, if the movement is small, if the spine is only curved a little bit, you can probably get away with this, just making sure that you don't parent your bones to your structures until after you've auto rigged. The other option you have is simply to not curve spine 1 and spine 2. To go ahead and put curvature in the neck and the head and in the hips, but simply let the spine 1 and spine 2 stay relatively straight so they don't move very much when you auto rig. That's another option you have there. But it's a situation you need to be aware of. Now let's move on and take a look at a manually rigged spine, where the first solution I mentioned is actually a little more of a possibility. So here we have a spine ready for a manual rig, and we'll just go ahead and manually rig the Bezier IK here. So we've got spine 3, spine 2, and spine 1, and just like we did before, we're going to go into the rigging options, and we're going to add a Bezier IK rig. And once again, it snapped those into line. But notice it didn't move spine 3, so we still have the curvature of spine 3 going into the neck there. So our overall shape hasn't changed that much. But perhaps more importantly, we can actually execute the change that I described before. So again, you don't want to parent your bones until after you've run your Bezier IK script. But then you could take the midsection controller and move it back until you reposition this anchor point where you want it. Then go ahead and parent your bone to that structure, and then simply take this mid controller and zero it out at that position so its neutral position is holding that spine curve. And also notice that the upper part of the rig does not move when we adjust this, so it doesn't shift the position of any of your other rigging. So this is a really good solution to this, allows you to have your curved spine and have everything work the way you want it to without any unwanted deformation of your character. This is again another advantage of manually rigging your torsos. Okay, that's it for our first torso lesson. We've looked at auto rigging and manually rigging torsos with separate necks and heads. In the next lesson, we're going to look at rigging torsos of characters without separate necks and heads, where the head is simply merged directly into the torso. I'll see you then.